Welcome to Naked History. You're listening to Unearthed.
Petra, an ancient and mysterious city of stone, concealed by the desert.
Petra suddenly appears almost out of nowhere, and then it disappears very quickly.
Petra in Jordan is famous for its extraordinary beauty. But very little is known about this vast metropolis or the civilization that built it.
The biggest challenge with Petra is its scale. It's a huge city, and we haven't even begun to touch even 2% of it.
But now, archaeologists are using the latest techniques to resurrect the lives of Petra's forgotten people. Who were they, and why did they disappear?
Not very much has been known about the daily lives of the normal people who inhabited Petra. I think Petra represents a major challenge for archaeologists.
The only way to discover why Petra was abandoned is to lift this mighty metropolis from the sands. We'll bring back to life the astonishing monuments of this forgotten civilization to reveal what happened to the greatest lost city of the ancient world. On the edge of the Arabian desert lie the ruins of a forgotten metropolis, Petra. One of the greatest cities of the ancient world. 2,000 years ago, Petra's kings were the contemporaries of famous rulers like Julius Caesar and lived at the time of Christ. But why do we know so little about this once great civilization?
Petra was one of the great international cities of the ancient world. It's a city that's cut largely out of the living sandstone.
This vast city lies hidden at the end of a winding passageway almost a mile long. This natural split in the rock is known as the Seek, and it leads to Petra's most famous monument, the Treasury. This elaborate tomb is carved deep into the rock face, familiar to millions from the Indiana Jones movies. But it's just a glimpse of what's hiding here. Deeper towards the city's center, dozens more tombs line the cliff walls, along with a theater for over 8,000 people. How did a civilization grow so powerful that it could create so many extraordinary buildings and yet leave behind so little about itself? The first explorers to stumble across Petra discovered a city unlike anything they had ever seen. A labyrinth of strange caves and breathtaking architecture. It is the long-lost capital of an ancient nomadic people called the Nabateans. Archaeologist Glenn Corbett investigates why they created this unique city.
Very, very little of this ancient city has actually been discovered, and so for the archaeologists, it represents a real challenge.
Glenn's on his way to Petra's famous treasury. He thinks a clue to the city's origins lies with its puzzling architecture. This monument is covered with features from different cultures that should have nothing in common with each other. Petra's treasury is a beautiful but bewildering structure. Griffins sit on top of Corinthian-style columns, with axe-wielding warriors and eagles of the Greek god Zeus. But in the middle is a statue that resembles the Egyptian goddess Isis. And inside, this iconic monument is even stranger. Behind the facade is just an empty chamber, perhaps a feasting hall for the dead. And beneath it all, archaeologists have discovered the simple burial chamber of a rich and powerful family. So could the strange design of these monuments reveal why such a city was built? Ancient writers described the Nabateans as nomads from Arabia. But Petra looks more like a Greek or Roman city on the edge of the desert.
We see all the basic elements of classical Greco-Roman architecture here. We see the columns, the floral capitals, the decorated friezes. We see the broken pediment, the central tholos. And amid all of these architectural elements, we see the gods and goddesses and mythological figures that honestly to the average Nabatean wouldn't have made that much sense.
But Glenn believes there is a hidden meaning to Petra's monuments that reveals who the Nabateans were and why they built this city. and he thinks the answers lie buried in the city's center. The secretive Nabateans left almost no written records, but they did leave a vast archaeological treasure trove. Today, American and Jordanian archaeologists are sifting through the huge heaps of sand that cover this city.
So many things that we have come out of this dump.
Pottery like this reveals that the Nabateans were rich and sophisticated.
Very nice. This, for example, is a very, very nice piece of Nabatean painted pottery. Very fine, very thin, almost eggshell thin wares. Very characteristic of the Nabateans during their heyday.
The sheer volume of material in Petra reveals that nearly 2,000 years ago, Nabatean society changed dramatically. These nomads decided to build a new kind of city, almost overnight.
It's really unbelievable how much pottery we find at just any archaeological site, but especially large ancient cities like Petra. You can walk the surface of Petra and see thousands and thousands of sherds.
So what drove Petra's nomads to become city slickers? Ancient writers say that the city lay on the world's greatest trade route, across the desert to the Mediterranean Sea. The Nabateans settled here to control this trade in incense, spices, and textiles, becoming extremely wealthy. They decided to pour their new money into creating incredible masterpieces. But they used ideas from Greece and Rome that flowed back into Petra. So did the Nabateans just abandon their old way of life? Glenn's pottery comes from a shrine called the Temple of the Winged Lions. Discoveries here reveal that it was dedicated to a powerful Nabatean goddess called Al-Uzza 2,000 years ago.
This temple, as far as we know, was probably built when the city was really exploding with a massive building program.
Glenn and his colleagues are still piecing together exactly what this sacred temple looked like, but they've discovered that it hides a secret. This temple may look Greek or Roman on the outside, like so many of Petra's buildings. But the layout of the central sanctuary is based on an ancient Arabian design.
A lot of the decorative elements of the temple are actually much more common to Greek and Roman architecture. But at the same time, that's something of a veneer because the temple itself is very much a Nabatean spiritual house. It's very much worshiping the supreme Nabatean goddess Al-Uzza.
The Nabateans built a new kind of city that fused nomadic Arabian culture with new ideas coming in from Greece and Rome. Glenn thinks their kings were trying to announce their arrival on the world stage.
Well, we have to remember that when the Nabateans really constructed this city in the 1st century BC and 1st century AD, they were really major players in the economies and caravan trades of that time. And definitely to make themselves major players on that international stage that included Herod and the Caesars and Antony and Cleopatra, they really had to present themselves as equal partners.
Petra emerged from the desert as the symbol of a new, powerful civilization. But there's a mystery. How could a thriving metropolis survive in such an inhospitable place? Archaeologists think the answer lies with the desert's most precious commodity, water. Can new discoveries reveal how Petra's citizens transformed this dry and dusty world into an astonishing Garden of Eden? Archaeologist David Graff investigates how the Nabateans were masters of their environment.
There was a population of at least 10 to 20,000 people living in the Petra region, and they had to be supplied with the necessities of life, but that's a lot of people.
David thinks the secret to Petra's success lay with the Nabateans' unique ability to harness water from the world around them. Dotted around Petra are canyons like the Sikh, that are natural water channels modified by the Nabateans. A barely visible water pipeline runs along the length of this winding passage until it passes underneath a faded carving. 2,000 years ago, these giant sculptures represented camels, led by a merchant on his way to do business. These pipelines fed fresh water to the center. But how did they get enough water to sustain an entire city of tens of thousands of people? 6 miles north of Petra is a rocky outcrop called Baja, where David leads a team digging for answers. Today, the land beneath it is bone dry. But even so far from the city center, archaeologists like Zayed al-Salamin find hints of an extensive water network.
Rainfall was very limited, about 250 millimeters per year, and therefore they were able to collect every drop of water during this limited rainy season to be used throughout the year.
The mysterious remains of pipelines and forgotten dams cover the ground at Baja. What were they for? Zayed comes across a clue, a cavity cut into the rock. But he doesn't think this is for storing water. It's even more surprising. A wine press.
This is an advanced one. It consists of 3 major basins. First of all, grapes are placed in the central part of the press. Then it's pressed and squeezed by feet.
The number of water pipes and wine presses suggests something remarkable was going on here. David's team investigates another strange feature that lies nearby. As they dig beside this rock, they uncover a wall. It looks like a storage depot, suggesting that Baja was producing a lot of wine. David thinks it's time to throw away our old notions about these resourceful people.
The general assumption about the Nabateans is that they were nomads, didn't drink wine, and were not involved in agriculture. But we know that's not the case now.
The discoveries at Baja prove that the Nabateans were able to harness so much water. They didn't just make wine. They had enough to plant and grow extensive vineyards here.
What I find so ingenious about the Nabateans is they could take a desolate landscape and find little niches to develop for agriculture.
So how did this water system work? The Nabateans created an impressive water network, channeling water to where it was needed from miles around. In the city center, they built a tunnel into the rock and dams to reroute the water flow. Engineers lined the Sikh passageway with clay pipes. The ends of the pipes were tapered to create a high-pressure supply. But across the kingdom, they created cisterns lined with hydraulic concrete to store the precious water underground. David thinks that this same technology extended far beyond the city center.
Most places have a spring. There's no spring here. The amazing thing is this is rainwater, and the rainwater is very minimal. So it took a lot of creativity, of engineering skill to channel that water into reservoirs and preserve it. And that's the amazing achievement of Baja.
Nabatean ingenuity built a rich and powerful city, an artificial paradise in a dry and desolate region. But at its height, Petra fell victim to one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world, Rome. An arsenal of buried weapons hints at a forgotten battle in the city streets. So did the feared Roman legions destroy Petra? Nearly 2,000 years ago, the great superpower of the ancient world marched into Petra. Rome absorbed the Nabateans into her vast empire, boasting that their city had been acquired, not captured. But did Petra's citizens really welcome Roman rule with open arms? Archaeologist Tom Parker thinks we need to rewrite this version of history.
For years, the scholarly consensus was this was a relatively peaceful event. But there's been more and more evidence to suggest that this was a takeover that was accompanied by considerable violence.
So did Petra resist Roman rule? Tom believes that a clue lies over in the city's great temple. Deep in the remains of this colossal structure, archaeologists have made a surprising discovery. Hundreds of stone missals, each one the size of a small soccer ball, were found right by the main entrance. Among them were 162 arrowheads made of iron. These weapons were hidden here thousands of years ago. What is military equipment doing inside one of Petra's greatest civic buildings? And to whom did it belong? Tom takes a closer look at the great stone balls. They're typical of the kind of weapons used by Roman soldiers.
Behind me is a store of 100 rounded stone balls. They might have been hurled by catapults, or they might have been hurled by hand.
There are no ancient records of a hostile Roman takeover, but Tom thinks they were certainly ready for war.
We know that the Romans were prepared for very serious resistance because they had assembled massive forces from 3 different provinces.
Even so, Tom's not so sure that these missiles really are Roman.
We know a lot about the Roman army. It was very standardized, and we have massive amounts of evidence from all corners of the empire. For the Nabatean army, in contrast, we know virtually nothing.
Archaeologists think that most Nabatean soldiers probably fought either on foot with spears or as a cavalry and were expert archers. They built simple watchtowers to guard their city, carefully positioned to detect invaders early. By contrast, we know the Romans had advanced siege weapons, giant crossbows and catapults that could launch stone missiles over 1,000 feet. But before the Romans seized Petra, they and the Nabateans sometimes fought side by side against common enemies. So could the Nabateans have copied or stolen these weapons from Rome? Tom thinks that the missiles are Nabatean. The most likely scenario is that the Nabateans stockpiled weapons here.
The balls were found in what appears to be a destruction layer. It looks like some of the doorways had been blocked off, and that's quite surprising to find in this context because this is not a military building of any kind. We're in the center of the city.
The discovery of these stone balls hints at a desperate last stand at the entrance to the Great Temple. Tom imagines the Nabateans hurling them down onto the advancing Roman legionaries.
The Romans were probably trying to come up the stairs, under fire, presumably. But they had a so-called formation called a testudo, a tortoise, where they could interlock their oblong shields over their heads. That might have well deflected some of these balls that were hurled at them, or arrows as well.
But the fighting seems to have spread beyond the Great Temple. More buildings along the main street also show scars of a violent takeover.
The areas that are most defensible are the elevated structures above the streets. The Nabateans might have fortified individual buildings within the city to try to hold out, and I think that the Great Temple is our best example of that so far.
If there was such a savage fight in the streets of Petra, why did Roman writers ignore it?
This was probably a fairly minor military affair from a Roman perspective. But from the Nabatean perspective, of course, this was a devastating blow. But in the end, of course, the odds were just too great against them.
Rome's military machine toppled Petra's rulers. But did the arrival of the empire also spell disaster for the Nabatean way of life? Archaeologists search for clues beneath a mysterious ruin at the top of a remote ridge. Can a crumbling ancient text at last reveal what happened to the people of Petra? Archaeologist Megan Perry investigates how the Nabateans adjusted to life under foreign occupation.
One of the big things we're trying to figure out is how much did Petra really change when Rome took it over? We really have no idea.
Megan hunts for clues beneath a mysterious wall that runs along the city's north ridge. The wall is made from thousands of rough-hewn sandstone blocks and filled with rubble. Archaeologists have discovered the foundations were built when the Romans arrived, and it appears to run straight through a residential neighborhood, carving up ordinary Nabatean houses. So what does the wall's strange construction tell us about life in Roman Petra? Megan's first job is to try and work out who built this wall. She uses innovative laser scanning technology.
The laser scanning shoots out a laser, and it bounces back almost like a reflection.
Her team has scanned this entire wall with extreme precision.
One of the things that we can see is that the wall, it's kind of a hodgepodge of different types of stones that have been obviously borrowed from different locations on the site, from other structures. So right here you can see how poorly built it is, with this earlier house wall being incorporated into the city wall. And you can see here, rather than cutting through this structure, it actually kind of incorporates this wall within the construction of the city wall itself. So it's sort of rather sloppily built.
Megan's intrigued by the way the wall is built. She takes a closer look at the ruins with her colleague Tom Parker.
This thing butts up. It's possible that this is a ballista platform.
Tom thinks the wall hides traces of Roman military technology. This could be the base for a fearsome weapon called a ballista.
These were catapults that shot these bolts that the Roman army employed, and they could be mounted on a platform here up against the wall to be aimed down into the wadi. Every legion, we're told, had 60 of these assigned to it, and it was manned by a crew of 3, and it was essentially a large crossbow.
Did the Roman army hastily build this wall to hold down a hostile population?
This ridge really commands the whole center of Petra. And so if you're going to install a military garrison here, this is the ideal spot.
But once the garrison had settled in, how did it change this city? Megan suspects that most aspects of day-to-day life carried on as normal.
This is a typical Roman cooking pot, very typical for anywhere around this region. And most of what we have here is the debris of just everyday domestic life. People's broken cooking pots getting thrown into the dump.
But the top of the ridge hides a shocking secret. It's dotted with simple tombs. In Petra, the living and the dead were side by side.
These are the tombs of the ordinary Nabatean folks, the ones that would not have the money or the prestige to be buried in some of the facade chamber tombs that surround the city.
Several generations could be buried in chambers like this. But Megan's discovered that the Nabateans suddenly stopped burying their dead here, at around the same time that the wall was built and the Romans arrived.
This is one of the clear pieces of evidence that we have of how the Roman annexation of Nabatea really affected the daily lives of its citizens.
So why did Petra's new rulers stop the Nabateans living amongst the dead, ending a practice that had existed for hundreds of years?
The Romans have very strict rules about where the dead can be buried. They would have considered it very polluting and very odd. So they would definitely prohibit any kind of burial within the city wall.
The Romans changed Nabatean civilization, but they also invested a huge amount of cash into the city. As the Roman Empire expanded across the Middle East, cities like Petra continued to flourish. But they started to look very different. At Petra, the Romans may have built the impressive street that runs through the center of the city, lined with massive columns. Next to the great temple, the Romans built public baths, the trademark of their civilization. Finally, the Romans built a triumphal arch over the entrance to the Sikh. The message to visitors was clear. Petra was still open for business, but Rome was here to stay. Petra and her people managed to adapt to life under Roman rule, and they continued to prosper as part of the empire. But for how long? Can new discoveries reveal the true glory of Petra's astonishing city center and the killer blow that brought it crashing down? Almost 2,000 years ago, Petra joined the Roman Empire, one of the richest and largest realms of the ancient world. But today, its tombs and temples are haunting ruins. So what happened to the mysterious Nabateans who built this city? Archaeologist Leanne Badal thinks a clue lies beneath an artificial oasis that the Nabateans created next to the Great Temple.
We are looking across to the garden and pool complex. So imagine a grove of palm trees, a very shaded area with water in the background. After a journey through the desert, this kind of artificial oasis, would be quite impressive to anybody visiting Petra.
The Great Temple once stood proud in the center of the city. A glorious facade, 5 stories high, the largest freestanding building in Petra. It towered high above the city with an elaborate entrance of triple colonnades, containing over 100 columns. But the garden next to it was even more impressive. Excavations revealed the remains of a magnificent Olympic-sized pool. So what happened to it? And could it reveal why Petra came to an end? Leanne discovers how the technology that maintained this garden broke down. She thinks that this groove in the rock was once a chute or even a waterfall that supplied the pool with fresh water. But today, even her excavations are full of sand and silt that continues to build up.
Everything here, all of this soil, is just filled this trench just since in the last couple of years. When we first started excavating in 2013, the silt was all the way up, about halfway up this cliff. You can see the white coloring, the change of the color of the sandstone. So all of this was a big slope of soil. And when we excavated, the trench went down another 2 or 3 meters.
At some point, this pool was abandoned and left to fill with silt. Why? On the other side of the garden, Leanne spots the footprint of a devastating event.
What we have here is the bedrock shelf for the promenade that went all the way around the pool. There must have been columns here. There must have been a nice colonnade, but there's nothing left of it. But we did find some fragments in the pool.
Leanne thinks she knows what caused this damage. A massive earthquake that destroyed many grand buildings beyond repair in the year 363.
These are some of the marble fragments that came out of the trench in the pool, and you can see they're just fragments, but some of them have a nice curved face, which tell us that they were from a circular feature like a column. And you can see, if you look at it wet, the great color of it. And you can't really reuse pieces like this and make another column.
So did this disaster send Petra into decline? Leanne has discovered something strange. The pool started to dry up almost 150 years before the earthquake hit.
We know that it began that early because there is more than a half meter of soil with many animal bones and pottery sherds that covered the bottom of the pool before the earthquake.
The debris tells Leanne that Petra's citizens were either unwilling or unable to look after this garden.
They stopped maintaining the pool, which tells us that even well before this earthquake, that there was a decline in the status of this site, the use of this site, if they were no longer bothering to even clean out all of the dirt and the trash.
So why was no one bothering to maintain this pool? Although the earthquake destroyed much of the city center, Petra's troubles began 150 years earlier, soon after the Romans arrived. New roads shifted the trade routes towards other cities in the empire, meaning Petra was no longer the hub of commerce across the desert. The city started to dwindle. People continued to live here, but many of its ancient palaces and temples were never rebuilt. And the beautiful garden next to the Great Temple became a field used for growing crops.
If the city itself is losing its status at the end of this Roman period, and it's losing its kind of status and wealth, that something like maintaining this big pool would have been a diversion of resources that perhaps just eventually became unnecessary or impossible.
The loss of its trade routes hit Petra hard. But was this the end for the Nabateans and their great city? Now can an extraordinary ancient text discovered in a lost church reveal what happened to the people of Petra. 500 years after Petra burst into life, many of this city's ancient Nabatean tombs and temples lay in ruins. Falling trade had reduced parts of it to a ghost town. Shattered columns still lie exactly where they fell during a great earthquake. This should have been the beginning of the end for Petra. But archaeologist Barbara Porter discovers how its citizens were more resilient than anyone ever imagined. She investigates an extraordinary archaeological treasure trove that reveals the rise of a new, smaller city.
In my mind, these really have rewritten the history of the 6th century Petra.
These charred scrolls are called the Petra papyri. The faded writing on them is still visible, thanks to a slow-burning fire that preserved them as charcoal.
This fire hadn't happened, they would have been essentially as organic material rotted in the grounds of Petra.
The papyri were discovered in one of Petra's churches. They're the archive of a local man called Theodorus. They give us a unique insight into how he and his friends had bounced back nearly 200 years after the earthquake.
This first document has to do with actually Theodorus and his arrangements for family property, and basically leading up to the fact that he will marry his first cousin, Stephanus.
These papyri reveal a new Christian city. Its people were still marrying and haggling over property, and they kept alive Nabatean traditions.
We know, for example, that Theodorus means lover of God in Greek, but his father and grandfather were Obadianos, which is Obadat, a great Nabatean name, great king. These people were still honoring their Nabatean forefathers.
These records reveal that Petra was still far from poor. So why did Theodorus and his fellow citizens leave their ancestral temples in ruins? Barbara visits where the papyri were found.
I feel that this Petra church is very much a hidden treasure.
She thinks that Petra's now Christian citizens chose not to rebuild temples that were dedicated to the old gods.
What's interesting, of course, is that with the Temple of the Lions being so close and mostly being destroyed in the 363 earthquake, of course, by the time they're building right nearby, they've got the perfect source to rob out and reuse that ancient material from that Nabatean structure. All of the capital elements, and even probably these columns, probably came from there.
Petra's citizens were still rich enough to cover the floor of their new church with exquisite mosaics. Some of these creatures they show are exotic, others more down to earth.
What we're looking at is a camel who's laden down with these huge, big logs. He doesn't look very happy. And you've got on either side, although their heads are missing, 2 camel herders who are obviously trying to drag him along.
But Petra's Christian citizens didn't abandon their entire past. This mosaic portrays the 4 seasons as Roman gods and goddesses, the same ones who captured the imagination of the very first Nabateans. Their actual faces may even be modeled on real people.
Each one of these tells some story, whether it's a pretty wonky-looking fish, to details of spring herself, where here she is. She's identified by the Greek inscription above her head, called Irene, and she is, in my mind, simply gorgeous. She's got an emerald necklace, she's got bracelets. That's an elegant lady who's dressed to the nines, wearing her jewelry, and offering you a bowl of roses.
What they have discovered so far is a remarkable people who adapted and survived for far longer than anyone thought.
Even though that we've excavated a number of the most important monuments of Petra, there's actually still tons and tons to discover. It's really only through archaeology that we're beginning to get some insight into the daily lives of the actual Nabateans, the real people who built the city.
The Nabateans had their own kings, their own coinage, their own laws, their own administration, and their own culture, and a quite brilliant one at that.
The true history of Petra's extraordinary people is only now starting to be uncovered. The first Nabateans transformed this rocky terrain into a magnificent city that still inspires awe in visitors today. Their ingenuity allowed them to build a man-made oasis on the edge of the desert. Petra's citizens had a remarkable ability to cope with whatever life threw at them, while retaining their own unique heritage. Petra, the hidden city, is at last giving up its secrets.
Naked History is brought to you by Element 18. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a comment below and subscribe to our channel for new videos every week.